That last section kind of cut off this little video somewhat midway through, so we'll go ahead and watch the whole thing now.
As this mountain biker heads up the trail, the breakfast he ate this morning is being burned to power his bike ride. His breathing rate increases as his leg muscles demand more oxygen to burn more fuel. Let's zoom down to where this fuel is burned, our cells. Here, the blood vessel on the left delivers fuel and oxygen to a single muscle cell. In cellular respiration, energy and fuel is converted to ATP, shown here as starbursts. Most ATP is made in the cell's mitochondria. ATP powers the work of the cell, such as contraction. Let's take a closer look at how ATP is produced from a molecule of glucose, our fuel. Only the carbon skeleton is shown to keep things simple. The first step is called glycolysis, and it takes place outside the mitochondria. To begin the process, some energy has to be invested. Next, the molecule is split in half. Now, the molecule NAD+, an electron carrier, picks up electrons and hydrogen atoms from the carbon molecule, becoming NADH. Keep track of the electron carriers. They play an important role by transporting electrons to reactions in the mitochondria. In the final steps of glycolysis, some ATP is produced, but not much. For every glucose molecule, only 2 net ATPs are produced outside the mitochondrion. However, glycolysis has produced pyruvic acid, which still has a lot of energy available. Let's follow this pyruvic acid molecule into a mitochondrion to see where most of the energy is extracted. As the molecule enters the mitochondrion, 1 carbon is removed, forming carbon dioxide as a byproduct. Electrons are stripped, forming NADH. Coenzyme A attaches to the 2-carbon fragment, forming acetyl-CoA. Coenzyme A is removed, and the remaining 2-carbon skeleton is attached to an existing 4-carbon molecule that serves as the starting point for the citric acid cycle. The new 6-carbon chain is partially broken down, releasing carbon dioxide. Several electrons are captured by electron carriers, and more carbon dioxide is released. The carbon dioxide that you exhale comes from the reactions of cellular respiration. 2 ATPs are produced by the citric acid cycle for each molecule of glucose. At this point, only a small number of ATPs have been produced. However, more energy is available in the electrons that are being transported by electron carriers. While the citric acid cycle starts another round, let's follow an electron carrier to the next step in the process. Electron carriers such as NADH deliver their electrons to an electron transport chain embedded in the inner membrane of the mitochondrion. The chain consists of a series of electron carriers, most of which are proteins that exist in large complexes. Electrons are transferred from one electron carrier to the next in the electron transport chain. Let's take a closer look at the path electrons take through the chain. As electrons move along each step of the chain, they give up a bit of energy. The oxygen you breathe pulls electrons from the transport chain, and water is formed as a byproduct. The energy released by electrons is used to pump hydrogen ions, the blue balls, across the inner membrane of the mitochondrion, creating an area of high hydrogen ion concentration. Hydrogen ions flow back across the membrane through a turbine. Much like water through a dam, the flow of hydrogen ions spins the turbine, which activates the production of ATP. These spinning turbines in your cells produce most of the ATP that is generated from the food you eat. The process you've just observed, cellular respiration, generates 10 million ATPs per second in just one cell. That ATP can power a biker up the trail, or it can power your brain cells as you learn challenging biology topics.
So the narrator there went at a pretty fast pace. Of course, you can watch this on your own again and stop it and rewind a little bit and stop it and watch it. We're going to go through these steps step by step, but the nice thing about the video is it's a nice visual representation of cellular respiration. and refer back to it as needed as we continue this topic. So, quick overview of cellular respiration. The first step is called glycolysis, and the word root lysis refers to cutting or splicing, and glyco is for a carbohydrate or a sugar. So it's the splitting of glucose into two molecules of pyruvic acid. And that's what you see here in the green rectangle. And this occurs outside of the mitochondria, just in the cytoplasm. So glycolysis is the splitting of glucose into two pyruvic acid molecules, and that releases a little bit of ATP. Okay. Then the next step is inside the mitochondrion, and that is the citric acid cycle. If I could read, citric acid cycle, also called the Krebs cycle, after Dr. Krebs. And that completes the breakdown of the pyruvic acid molecules. So the complete breakdown of glucose is within the citric acid cycle inside the mitochondria, and a little bit of ATP is released there. And then finally, the glycolysis step and the citric acid cycle steps produce a little bit of ATP directly, but the most important thing that they're producing, glycolysis and the citric acid cycle, is the release of the high energy electrons that are put onto electron carriers, NAD+ and FAD, and those molecules are carrying high energy electrons to step 3, which is the electron transport chain. Excuse me. And as you see here, the large ATP symbol, most of the ATP that's produced from the breakdown of glucose, blood sugar, is through the steps of the electron transport chain. And that was the video that showed that little turbine moving. We'll talk about that. All right, and that's also within the mitochondrion. So energy from the electrons ultimately is used to produce ATP, and the electrons come from the breakdown of glucose, first in glycolysis, then in the citric acid cycle. So, excuse me, overall equation for cellular respiration, we start with a carbohydrate, the chemical formula for something like glucose, and oxygen through the entire steps of glycolysis, citric acid cycle, and the electron transport chain. Carbon dioxide is produced as a waste gas, water is produced as a waste molecule, and then about 32 molecules of ATP for every molecule of glucose that's the beginning molecule, the starting point. Okay? So this C6H12O6 is glucose, right? A simple sugar, monosaccharide, and the oxygen producing carbon dioxide, water, and ATP, adenosine triphosphate. So the first step, glycolysis. So the glucose molecule is broken down. That takes a little bit of energy input, initially as that video showed you, and then that leads to ultimately 2 pyruvic acid molecules, which only have 3 carbons each. All the hydrogens are not shown here. The starting glucose molecule only has 6 carbons. And again, the other hydrogen atoms are not shown here either for simplicity. But notice it's a multiple step process just in glycolysis. Okay? The only thing I need you to know is that the 6 carbon containing glucose molecule gets split into 2 pyruvic acid molecules. Each one has 3 carbons each. So the carbons in glucose are the carbons in the 2 pyruvic acid molecules. And notice that it takes a little bit of energy to get this going. It requires 2 ATP. 4 ATP are produced. So the net yield is going to be only 2 ATP, all right? Because it takes 2 to make 4. So the net yield of ATP just in glycolysis is just 2 ATP molecules. Not that much, not enough for, a human animal to survive. But actually glycolysis produces enough ATP for very simple organisms like bacteria to survive. So the 3 carbon molecules, during their breakdown, the glucose breakdown to form the 3 carbon molecules that ultimately are pyruvic acid. During the lysis, the breaking of the glucose, some high energy electrons are produced or removed from glucose. So the high energy electrons are picked up by what are called electron carriers. And the first one is NAD+. So notice it's got 2 little spaces here in the little model to indicate that each one picks up a couple of electrons, high energy electrons. They don't talk about it that much in the video, but look at the equation. NAD+ picks up a couple of electrons, and then also an H picks up a hydrogen atom. All right? And that's not really shown anywhere, but it does pick up the hydrogen, which is why NAD+ becomes NADH. And that is an important little point because we'll talk about those hydrogens later. Okay? And then these electron carriers, they're called electron carriers because they're carrying electrons, but also the hydrogen ions, which are also called protons. Those electron carriers will work their way over to the electron transport chain, right? Eventually. Okay, 4 ATPs are formed, but remember, it takes 2 to get this whole process going, so the net yield is only 2 ATP. Okay, so these pyruvic acid molecules that are formed from glycolysis, this is outside the mitochondria. The pyruvic acid molecules enter into the mitochondria after some modification. That's what we'll talk about here. So the pyruvic acid is groomed, modified, before entering into the citric acid cycle within the mitochondria. So the pyruvic acid loses a carbon to form carbon dioxide. Notice 3 carbons starting with the pyruvic acid. You lose a carbon to form carbon dioxide, and we get something called acetic acid that becomes acetyl-CoA because, so something called coenzyme A latches onto the acetic acid to form acetyl-CoA. But notice 2 carbons from the 3 carbons in the starting pyruvic acid. The carbon that's lost forms carbon dioxide, and that's actually a poisonous substance. So that's inside your mitochondria. It works its way out into your cells, and it diffuses out of your cells, ultimately diffuses into your bloodstream, eventually gets to your lungs, and you breathe it out. So that's the source of the carbon dioxide that you breathe out when you exhale is from cellular respiration, the breakdown of glucose and then pyruvic acid to form what's called acetyl-CoA. Okay? And then also notice, we form another high energy electron carrier that's carrying electrons and hydrogen ions or protons. Okay? So the electrons are harvested, more electrons to form more NADH. And again, the NADH, these electron carriers, work their way over to the electron transport chain. Okay? And then that's the formation of acetyl-CoA. So this is the molecule that then goes into the Krebs cycle, which is also called the citric acid cycle. Okay? So the citric acid cycle extracts most of the electrons from the starting molecules. And remember that that acetic acid or the acetyl-CoA is what enters into the citric acid cycle. The acetyl-CoA has only 2 carbons, okay? But it latches onto a precursor, a pre-existing molecule that's 4 carbons long. So 4 plus 2 makes 6 carbon molecule that processes through and works through the citric acid cycle. Okay? And the input for each acetic acid or acetyl-CoA that enters, some ATP is produced, some carbon dioxide is produced, but notice how many electron carriers are produced. Okay? 3 NADHs and 1 FADH2. Notice over here they're empty. They pick up electrons from the breakdown of the acetic acid as it cycles through the citric acid cycle. So most of the electron carriers